This lecture will cover the November-December public forum resolution. The slides were prepared by Jesse Meyer and edited by Stefan Bouchard, who will deliver this lecture. The resolution for November and December is resolved. The United States should adopt a declaratory policy of no first use. What does this resolution mean? I think if we look at a few key terms, it will become very, very clear. First of all, it is a declaratory policy, which means two things. One, that it's a public policy. This is not something we do in secret. Second is that it is really kind of legally binding. At least legally binding within the United States. It's obviously would be difficult to enforce this internationally, but it's legally binding within the United States, which does create an obligation. Second, what does no first use mean? No first use means that the United States would not use nuclear weapons as first in a conflict. So if we were attacked with conventional forces, or we were threatened with attack with conventional forces, or even potentially attacked with, chemical and biological weapons, we would not be the first to use nuclear weapons. Now, I think the other thing that's in there in the resolution, the other word that's important is the word policy. And this would probably not maybe even matter even if the word policy wasn't in there. To say first use, a declaratory policy, it's not just a statement that a country is making. It would necessarily include some modifications of our nuclear force structures, such as taking our nuclear weapons off alert, which essentially means it would take us longer to launch them in a conflict. We'd probably eliminate our land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, and you can read about some other changes that actually would, changes in our nuclear force posture, which would both make the policy credible, but also, there could be various pros and cons in terms of nuclear deterrence, includes of potential threats perceived by other countries. So this does involve changes in our nuclear force posture, which are, of course, subject to debate as much as just the declaration that we wouldn't use nuclear weapons first is. Now, what is the current policy? As a general kind of thumb, we would really not, rule of thumb, I should say, we would not use nuclear weapons against the vast majority of countries. Even under Trump's 2018 nuclear posture review states, the United States will not use or threaten to use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear states that are party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The Non-Proliferation Treaty is a treaty that went into effect in the 1970s that says that we don't want other countries to develop nuclear weapons. In exchange for these commitments, the superpowers will commit to nuclear disarmament. Now, we know that really hasn't happened, but the spread of nuclear weapons to other countries has been very slow. The U.S. obviously has an interest in that happening. You can see, and you may have heard on the news, the United States is working very hard to stop Iran from developing nuclear weapons. We can debate about what the best approach there is, but generally most people think it's not great for other countries to develop nuclear weapons. But anyhow, we'll talk more about that later. But anyhow, for now, what the U.S. has basically said is we're not going to use nuclear weapons against those countries. Now, it says that are in compliance with their obligations, right? So you say, well, what if a country has ratified the NPT, but they're not really in compliance with those obligations? That obviously kind of creates like a little bit of a loophole for the U.S. to kind of threaten nuclear use. And, of course, there are other broad exemptions, which will start kind of peeling this back a little bit, right? We can't threaten to use these against Russia, Iran, North Korea. Why? Well, because Russia, Iran are nuclear powers, okay, and they are our enemies. Iran, we say, is not in compliance with its NPT obligations. North Korea has obviously developed nuclear weapons. I mean, we could potentially use them against India and Pakistan as well, though we really wouldn't do that, right? So, but there's like China, North Korea withdrew from the treaty. They're not in compliance, but really anyone, because potentially anyone, I should say, because as we'll see in the next slide, the Trump administration has created a lot of exemptions. So the Obama and Trump administration have declared that the U.S. would only use the nuclear weapons in extreme circumstances to defend the United States of its allies and partners. Now, under the Obama administration, they said extreme circumstances was limited to a narrow range of contingencies. Really, to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in deterring non-nuclear attacks and to rely on diplomacy and conventional weapons. So the Obama administration was kind of emphasizing this, right, to kind of really at least narrow down kind of extreme circumstances under which we would use these nuclear weapons first. Now, the Trump administration, has kind of broadened this definition of extreme circumstances to include non-nuclear attacks, including non-nuclear attacks on our allies, and it could potentially include cyber attacks, even trade embargoes, potentially terrorist attacks. So you can see that you could interpret extreme circumstances in a more limited way, like the Obama administration does, or did, I should say, and more broadly as the Trump administration currently does. Now, it's also worth saying here that the Obama administration did consider a declaratory non-first use policy, but decided not to adopt that, primarily because our allies were really opposed to that. We'll talk about that more when we talk about some of the cons. So the Obama administration, or at least Obama himself, kind of favored a no first use policy, but decided not to adopt it out of concerns for what our allies thought, but then kind of limited it, at least, the no first use policy. The Trump administration has broadened it. You will also see that this policy is kind of referred to as calculated ambiguity. What does that mean? Well, that means it's like a little uncertain as to which conditions we would use them or would not use them. And if you just listen to what I said, you may get a sense of that. You may be thinking, okay, well, really, in what specific instances would we use or not use nuclear weapons first? Well, the whole point of the policy is to make that not very clear. And some people believe that calculated ambiguity, that uncertainty, actually enhances our deterrence. Now, there's one other term that you'll see floating around in this literature, and there's actually some additional articles on this. And some people say we should replace no first use with sole purpose. They're very similar, but they're not exactly the same. What sole purpose says is we would only use them to actually deter nuclear use. So, maybe we would use them first in a conventional conflict because we thought it was going to escalate to a nuclear level, or somebody was threatening nuclear use, right, against the United States. So then we decided to use it first. So it's not quite the same as no first use, but you'll see a lot of there are a lot of articles written on sole purpose. Some argue that the minor distinctions between the two are obviously pretty important, but I just want you to understand that, because when you are reading articles, you will find discussions of sole purpose, and you will find articles that are really written entirely about sole purpose also relevant to your debate. Now, do any other countries have no first use policies? Well, China has an unconditional no first use policy, publicly stated that it's declared since 1964. Some people question whether or not, as with any no first use declaratory policy, whether or not they would uphold that, but they do have that policy. Russia had a no first use policy from 1982 till 1993, but they changed the policy kind of out of fear of the U.S., but also when the former Soviet Union kind of fell apart in the early 1990s, and their economy and their conventional forces deteriorated quite substantially. And the U.S. at that time had a convention, and its Western allies in Europe had these large conventional force advantages. So they were like, well, maybe we're not going to say we won't use nuclear weapons first. Similarly, relevant to this conventional force question, is that India has a no first use policy that says we won't use nuclear weapons first unless we're attacked with chemical or biological weapons. Pakistan, right, which is their neighbor on the border that there's a lot of tension with, they've had limited wars with in the past. Pakistan said we're not going to have. Pakistan has not adopted a no first use policy. You say, well, maybe why? Are they threatening to use nukes? But no, but think about it, right? If India invaded Pakistan, India is like a much, much larger population than Pakistan. It's a much larger country. They could overrun Pakistan in a conventional war. So, okay, Pakistan says, hey, we'll use nuclear weapons to deter your conventional attack. So a lot of it is whether or not countries have nuclear no first use policies, not just like whether they think it's desirable, whether they want to avoid the risk of a nuclear war, which I think kind of everyone does in abstract. But if they don't think their conventional forces can handle a conventional attack on them, then they're going to say, hey, we'll use nuclear weapons, right, in order to defend ourselves. All right, so what are some of that kind of gives you some background, right, in terms of the topic, some major ideas to understand. What are some potential pro arguments? Well, First of all, there's a few different ways that this could kind of like reduce the risk of nuclear war. Even though it's not like a super large risk, right, in the status quo, it could reduce that risk. The first is a miscalculated war. Miscalculated war could occur when you think your enemy has a particular advantage, and that they may be kind of aiming to use that advantage and attack you. In this case, you may kind of say, okay, well, I need to initiate a war, or I need to initiate the use of nuclear weapons in a conventional war because I think I'm about to lose this battle. Maybe that calculation is false, or maybe like you just think you could win a war, right? You could say, okay, well, finally, we've kind of been in conflict with this country for years. We could just win a war, and you might miscalculate, and a war could start that way. That is different. Some people use the terms interchangeably, but that is different from an accidental war. An accidental war, and you can read about these in history, is, somebody thought a flock of geese were incoming nuclear weapons. All right, so then we decided, to say, okay, somebody almost used nuclear weapons in that instance because we thought we were being attacked, but it was actually just a flock of geese on the radar screen. So this could, having no nuclear, no first use, if we do things like change our nuclear posture and de-alert our nuclear weapons, it could also kind of reduce tensions between countries, that this could actually reduce the risk of accidental war. It would also kind of rein in our presidential power a little bit. You can just say, like, first strikes are bad. Some people say, oh, Trump, he's kind of radical and crazy. Maybe he'll just initiate a nuclear war. You can think of that, which you might, right? But there's always some concern, whether it's Trump or some other president, that they could order a nuclear first strike, and this would prevent that. Another type of argument is what we call a commitment trap. This is a very important pro-argument that they can also use to answer, of course, the con deterrence arguments. The commitment trap argument says that, look, we're not really, it deals with kind of our allies. So the United States has commitment to our allies in the form of security guarantees, nuclear security guarantees that say, look, if you're attacked, we'll defend you. So Japan, if you're attacked, we'll come to your defense. Countries in Europe that are our North Atlantic Treaty Organization allies, if you're attacked, we'll defend you, and we'll defend you with nuclear weapons. Now, some people say that this really is incredible, because if the Russia invaded Europe, yeah, we might defend Europe in a conventional war, okay, but look, we're not going to start nuking the Russians. Why? Because the Russians would nuke the United States. So people make the argument of like, hey, we're not going to give up New York to save Berlin, right? So if Berlin is being overrun by the Russians, okay, the argument is that it's not credible that we would actually nuke Russia because we know Russia would nuke New York City. So the advocates argue that this creates like a commitment trap where like we're kind of basically in a bind. We either have to, in order to maintain our credibility, we would have to nuke Russia, causing Russia to nuke New York, or we would not, nuke Russia, meaning that our credibility would go away because we've extended this nuclear security guarantee and we didn't use it. So we're kind of in this trap that undermines like the credibility of the policy, potentially undermining deterrence. There are arguments related to cost that, hey, if we have to maintain this first use policy, it's costly. We have to maintain our nuclear arsenal. I don't think that's a great argument because obviously changing our nuclear force posture would also cost money, but that is an argument. Other people say that this leads to arms races. It fuels arms races with Russia, China, the development of North Korea's weapons, right? Like these countries are concerned, say the U.S. has come out, and we currently have a declaratory policy that says we might use nuclear weapons first. Well, if we have a declaratory policy that says we might use nuclear weapons first, then we're going to have to be the first one like on that train. All right, they're going to have to be deterred, right? Like they're going to have to create deterrence from an attack from the United States, right? Imagine if, like, hey, the North Korea comes out and says, hey, we have a policy of, like, the first use of nuclear weapons. This is going to make the U.S. insecure. We're going to build up more weapons. The idea is of this arms race. The second big thing is nuclear proliferation. This is one of the major arguments in the evidence packet. The argument is just basically that other countries are considering developing nuclear weapons. And because the U.S. has this first use policy, we've prioritized the use of nuclear weapons essentially kind of in warfighting and defense policy. And then other countries are going to say, look, you have a policy of using nuclear weapons first. So we're not going to like not acquire nuclear weapons as we've committed to under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. We're going to defend ourselves as well. We are also going to build up nuclear weapons. So some people say, look, if the U.S. doesn't start reducing the role of nuclear weapons and the significance of the role that nuclear weapons play in our defense policy, then you're going to see more and more countries developing nuclear weapons. Some people say that right now China is considering rolling back its no first use policy due to the U.S. policy, but if the U.S. adopted this no first use policy, China would maintain its own. Other people say that India models the U.S. policy and that, in the status quo, they maybe become more nuclear aggressive. Maybe they'll give up their no first use policy. Probably kind of a bit of a stretch, but some people make arguments there and then say this had, kind of destabilizing implications on the India-Pakistan conflict. Other people say, look, we need to get no first use policy in order to get more of our allies and other people. Allies argument doesn't make a lot of sense, but just kind of international support for the containing Iran. It's kind of a little tough because there's obviously a lot of disagreements between the U.S. and other countries right now on how we should deal with Iran. And our allies generally oppose a no first use policy, but there is this Iran argument. Similar to the India-Pakistan modeling argument, some people say that we need to get Israel on board with the no first use policy. Most people think that Israel has stated that they don't have nuclear weapons, but most people think they do have nuclear weapons and they just haven't come out and said it. But some people say Israel needs to model a no first use policy so they don't use them in any war we have in the region. Other people say our current no first use policy, which is actually a policy of potential first use, threatens to drive North Korea weapons development. They're probably developing weapons for other reasons, as you can imagine, but that is an argument. Other people say that, look, if we adopted this no first use policy, that it would strengthen our soft power, how much other people like us, and be a peaceful gesture towards the world. Other people say, hey, this is kind of maintaining this first use policy, not a direct violation of international law, but it's a violation of our commitment to the rest of the world that we made to move towards nuclear disarmament under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And if we want these treaties and international legal structures and international norms to have credibility, then we need to adopt a policy of no first use. Now, what are the con arguments? There are a lot of good, strong con arguments. I do like this topic. I think the NSDA topics this fall have been really good. As you've been, probably debating Medicare, you see there are very strong arguments on both sides of the Medicare for All debate. I think there are really good arguments on both sides of this debate. As I said, the Obama administration, really, a more liberal administration, really considered adopting this policy, but did not because of the concerns of our allies and other security implications in the world. So I think there are strong arguments on both sides, but the con arguments are really kind of grounded in a way of a political theory of realism. That any nation, a realist international theorist holds that any country is ultimately going to act in their self-interest, just as any person would. They say it's human nature to act in your self-interest. You may do good and try to do good and those types of things, but when push comes to shove, you're ultimately going to act in your self-interest. And what they say is that any country, right, would ultimately act in its self-interest. So they say, a no first use policy is not credible, because countries aren't going to believe that we're not going to act in our self-interest if our self-interest was to use nuclear weapons. And B, it doesn't make sense to adopt a no first use policy when other countries are probably would use nuclear weapons first if it was in their self-interest. So, that you can use this kind of realism idea just to kind of undercut whether or not this policy would be followed, whether it's a good idea for countries to adopt it. Some of the broad criticisms of it are kind of grounded in that, whether or not it's kind of even credible. But obviously the second major argument, and there's a few underneath that fall from that, is just deterrence. Some people say, look, we need to threaten to use nuclear weapons first to deter nuclear attacks on the United States, to potentially de-escalate a conventional conflict. What does that mean? It's if we're attacked by conventional weapons, and we launch a nuke, that'll end the conflict, that'll de-escalate it. That's obviously debatable, but many deterrence theorists do argue that. Other people say, we need these nukes, we need to be able to deter chemical and biological weapons. So look, think about it. If we adopted a policy, said we'll never use nuclear weapons first, unless we're attacked with nuclear weapons, and then someone attacks us with the chemical and biological weapons, then we wouldn't be able to use them back. Similar with cyber attacks, some people say that we're more vulnerable to cyber attacks. As I mentioned, the Trump administration broadened this policy and said, look, if we become the victim of a cyber attack, we could potentially retaliate with nuclear weapons. No first use would take that off the table. You can look at specific instances too, such as deterring North Korea. Maybe we say, hey, we were never going to be the ones to use nuclear weapons first in a conflict, and North Korea invades South Korea, and we don't retaliate with nuclear weapons, and maybe at least for a time being, South Korea would be overrun. Some people say that one of the changes in force posture we would have to make is remove our tactical nuclear weapons, kind of our smaller battlefield nuclear weapons from Europe, which would undermine a deterrence against Russia. Other people say we might need to use a nuclear bunker buster in a conflict. A nuclear bunker buster, essentially, if a military force embeds deeply underground, then we may be able to use have to use a nuclear weapon to kind of blow up that force under the ground. People obviously make specific arguments in terms of why we need no first use to deter Russia against aggression in Europe, to deter Chinese aggression generally, but particularly against Taiwan. That we need to be able to threaten to use nuclear weapons first in those situations to undermine deterrence. The next category of arguments is kind of obviously can be related to the first, deterring Russia and China, since we rely on our allies to do that, but are also kind of based on the reaction of our allies. The first one is just allied nuclear proliferation. Some of our allies, particularly Japan and Germany, rely on us to defend them. And the reason they haven't developed nuclear weapons is because we have said, look, we will come to your defense if you are attacked. Well, these allies are very concerned that if we adopt a nuclear no first use policy and they're attacked by other conventional forces and we can't defend them with our conventional forces, and we pledge not to use nuclear weapons in retaliation to those attacks against them, right? Or to help them fend off those attacks, then they may just need to get nuclear weapons on their own. You can obviously see that think about if you learned about history of the world, right? That Japan is perceived as an imperial power in Asia, that it's attacked other countries in the past. Germany, obviously, right? World War II, right? So Nazism, right? Some people in those regions, for better or worse, do not trust those countries to develop nuclear weapons. And there's a lot of very strong negative implications that could develop from those countries developing nuclear weapons. So if the U.S. adopted this no first use policy, these countries may decide to adopt their own nuclear weapon or develop their own nuclear weapons, causing other countries to develop nuclear weapons, creating quite a problem. Now, of course, this would also hurt our relations with countries such as Japan. And with Western European countries, and now there are some Eastern European countries in it again, but with NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So if NATO, kind of the cohesion, if there are a lot of disagreements even within NATO, they would obviously be but they would be very upset if the U.S. adopted this policy. There's kind of basically irrefutable evidence on that this could end up weakening our NATO alliance, which could invite Russian aggression. It could also mean that there's a couple other impacts that people to read. That, hey, if NATO collapsed, then our European allies would have to spend more on their defense, hurting their own social welfare programs. If you debated the China topic last year about the Belt Road, there's a lot of kind of dispute about China's role in the development of 5G networks. And we're trying to keep Europe off those 5G networks. We're really putting a lot of pressure, diplomatic pressure, economic pressure, everything we can do to stop many European countries from kind of using China's 5G technology. Well, if our relations were devastated, it would be very hard to maintain our ability to prevent them from developing developing and supporting Chinese 5G technology, which could create its own security proliferation. Other people say just kind of these other countries developing nuclear weapons could increase terrorism. Now, there's another set of arguments that kind of deal with conventional war, right? The pros arguments can be focused on reducing kind of the use of nuclear weapons, but what would happen? What would happen if we made these doctrinal changes, right? It wouldn't just be that it's part of kind of what's topical, essentially, right? We would make a declaratory no first use policy that would include changes to our nuclear posture. But a consequence of that, a subsequent effect, not something that no first use would directly do, but would result is that we would start relying more on conventional weapons, right? We would develop more weapons that can kind of offset what we lost through our ability to strike first. Well, this has kind of cost implications, right? Which is why I don't think the pro-cost arguments are very good, but these types of weapons could be even more threatening. There's evidence that says like we would shift to precision-guided munitions, which threaten Russia and China even more. Think about it now too. We're trying to figure out how to integrate a lot of artificial intelligence into our defense strategy. Well, if we integrated a lot of that artificial intelligence, into our defense strategy, some people think that's really bad. But my point is, like, just generally, if we adopted no first use, we would, in some ways, people would see that, well, we're less secure. Our deterrent isn't as strong. So we need to strengthen our conventional force postures. I'm saying that could produce problematic things in and of itself. That could lead to wars. Those wars could subsequently escalate to the nuclear level, regardless of whether or not we had a no first use policy. Other people say we would even have to shift our nuclear forces to counter value targeting. So counter value targeting is when you target more cities. Counter force targeting is when you when you kind of target with your nuclear weapons the military facilities. All right, and the military infrastructure, which is more of what we do now. But if we didn't have, if we kind of backed off this nuclear force use policy, maybe we'd shift more to counter value targeting, which in the event of war would obviously kill a lot more people. Some people argue it's unethical. There is a big debate within nuclear deterrence literature about counter force versus counter value targeting that you could have. But that's strong arguments. You could also kind of just say our overall hegemony or leadership in the world would decline. And then finally, look, you could argue that nuclear proliferation is good. The spread of nuclear weapons is good. Now, obviously, on the con, you can't say that, look, you undermine nuclear assurance is causing nuclear proliferation, that's bad, and then say nuclear proliferation is good. But if the pro were to say, hey, we strengthen the non-proliferation treaty, we reduce the value of nuclear weapons, we create a norm against nuclear weapons, we slow nuclear proliferation, the con, instead of making the assurances arguments that our allies would develop nuclear weapons, they could say that nuclear proliferation is good. I think that allies developing nuclear weapons and that spreading around the world and creating a lot of insecurities is a better argument than nuclear proliferation good. But pro teams that want to argue nuclear proliferation bad need to be ready for the nuclear proliferation good, bad debate. Some kind of general kind of things for both sides in terms of framework, right? You can look at the overall cost-benefit analysis. Some people say role-playing. What is the best policy? I think that's kind of obvious, what you are trying to decide as, should the U.S. adopt this? So you could look at the cost-benefit analysis in terms of lives saved. You could also have a debate about the morality of nuclear weapons and the role of nuclear deterrence. So those are just some things that can kind of come up generally. In terms of some for the pro, I think the pro basically, in terms of a framework, wants to take a stance of international liberalism or neoliberalism. So liberalism says, is in contrast to realism, that people are kind of inherently good and that we can kind of get people to do good things, that everybody doesn't just look out for their own interests. Neoliberalists say that, well, maybe the realists are right that a lot of times people do look out for their own interests, but through laws and institutions, in this case international law and international institutions such as the NPT, we can strengthen, we can kind of regulate human behavior. We can successfully regulate it so people don't always look out for their own interest, and we can prevent them from doing so. So you could take that approach. You could also take a social constructivist approach. The social constructivists say that basically the world is kind of the world exists kind of as we understand it to be, and as we use our language to shape ideas and norms, and kind of in this case, de-emphasize the role of nuclear weapons. So social constructivists could say, look, if we come out with a policy, we say we're not going to use nuclear weapons first, we try to delegitimize or undermine the role of nuclear weapons in defense policy, then this can be effective. You can also just take the straight utility or kind of world survival. You can just say, look, nuclear weapons threaten the survival of the human race. We need to do everything we can to de-emphasize their role. You could kind of look at the economy. Like I say, I don't think the economy arguments are great. It's obviously, there probably are costs involved in maintaining a first use policy, but there are obviously costs involved in changing our nuclear force structure and probably relying more on conventional weapons. And again, kind of world cooperation, modeling, goodwill gestures. That's kind of basically a neoliberalist approach. The con, as you can imagine, they can support realism. What would rational actors in the real world, what would they hold them to? You could say we really have to deter. In the words of Teddy Roosevelt, you have to walk softly and carry a big stick. You can use hegemony. I kind of had listed it as an argument there, just kind of, but like, hey, we need to maintain our world-class status as a military power. And look, we have responsibilities to our allies. We have agreements that we made with our allies. Allied relationships are important in the world to peace, stability, to kind of the future of humankind. There's a lot of evidence written about this lately because the Trump administration doesn't really care as much about our allies in the current world order that's based around these allied relationships, right? Like Trump's willing to consider pulling the United States out of NATO or South Korea or Japan. So people are writing all kinds of evidence about kind of the role of allies and why they're important if they're opposed to this policy, or, there are some supporters who say, yes, like we shouldn't be so tied to our allies. Some things just to kind of consider. The con isn't rolling back nuclear first use, right? They're just arguing to maintain the status quo. So the con, this is traditional, like the last topic, Medicare for all, the pro is arguing for a change, the con is arguing for the status quo. So in this case, essentially the con is arguing that we should retain the option of first use. The second thing the pro really needs to think about is how to leverage the con offense, right? So we know that a very strong argument is allied on the con is allied assurances, all right, / allied proliferation, allied relationships. So the pro may want to start the debate with an argument about how the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is kind of being undermined in the status quo, that more countries are developing nuclear weapons. This makes the con argument non-unique, and that there's a hope, at least if we can stabilize the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the overall non-proliferation regime, that will stop the spread of nuclear weapons. They also might want to make an argument about commitment trap, undermining deterrence. All right, because we know obviously a strong con argument is going to deter. The other thing is, look, this is just one policy. If we're going to test nuclear weapons, maybe we'll resume nuclear testing. We can still do that. If we're going to modernize our nuclear forces, which the Trump administration has really continued to, we're still going to do that. So some arguments about why just kind of nuclear weapons are bad, or those kind of things, no first use, really doesn't solve for it, doesn't, right, at all. What is going to stop us from breaking this commitment? That'll be a big issue. This comes up all the time in public forum debates. I've seen in the past where the pro is kind of arguing for a treaty or international law, right? We see this we saw this in a lot of the debates about refugees. The con could just kind of win simply, lay judges would be persuaded, well, hey, look, this international law is not enforceable. There's no God that come in and force international law. It's kind of useless. All right, now, so that's kind of one thing that can help the con a lot. Now, on the flip side, the pro is arguably, and they would, especially in response to this argument, emphasize that they are making change in our nuclear force structure. So you got to be prepared to this side of the debate. Then what would be the reaction of the rest of the world to this policy? Right? Pro side's really going to emphasize that people would view this positively. It would strengthen kind of our soft power in the world. It would strengthen norms of non-proliferation. It would make kind of China and Russia and North Korea less afraid of us. The con's going to say, hey, this would result in a terrible shift to conventional weapons, including precision-guided munitions, and potentially greater integration of artificial intelligence into our defense strategies, okay, which would result in kind of a lot of insecurity. And then they'll combine that with arguments that our allies would kind of get really nervous and A, develop nuclear weapons, and B, just kind of undermine their relationships with us, increasing insecurity. So obviously this policy really is about the reaction of the rest of the world and how that impacts all those types of things. There's a few concepts and vocabulary that I think it's important to understand as you go for this debate. So non-proliferation. Proliferation just refers to the spread of anything. You could have the proliferation of a disease. Generally in this literature and kind of international relations, proliferation refers to the spread of nuclear weapons. Non-proliferation is the non-spread. The nuclear triad. The United States has nuclear weapons of land, sea, land in the United States, sea, and sometimes positioned abroad. Okay, the sea, underwater, in our nuclear submarines, and in the air, in terms of nuclear bombers. Why do we retain this triad? Because if an adversary were to strike us and say destroy the land, well then we can retaliate from our submarines. So it's important to understand it's a kind of important part of nuclear deterrence. De-alert means basically that it would be harder for us to launch our nuclear weapons quickly. Like we might demate them. So for example, we may take the warhead off the missile. What does that mean? Well, that means if there was a crisis, like we would have to kind of essentially reassemble it, which means we wouldn't make any quick decisions, right? We couldn't really launch like a nuclear first strike. Like we couldn't really use the nuclear weapons. It would be hard, right? So you can debate whether or not, this is a good idea, but that's what de-alerting refers to. Miscalculation, accidental war. I already explained the differences between the two earlier in the lecture, but I do want to emphasize they're not the same. Norms I explained as well. Norms are the idea that we can kind of delegitimate like the use of nuclear weapons. On the Non-Proliferation Treaty I just discussed. I have kind of generally discussed the deterrence, right? That you kind of have to, it's just like, well, maybe you carry a gun so people don't attack you, right? That can create some problems, but it could deter an attack. Well, same thing with the nuclear weapons. There are kind of a couple related concepts, and that is extended deterrence or security guarantees. Okay, extended deterrence says that what we would do for our allies is that we were basically extending our nuclear deterrent to them. So in other words, if like the Russians, right, were to attack Western Europe, they were to attack Germany, we would then say, okay, we are going to retaliate with our nuclear weapons. That is a security, well, a security guarantee is anything saying we'll come to your defense. A nuclear security guarantee says we'll come to your defense with nuclear weapons. No first use could undermine that nuclear security guarantee because if they were attacked with conventional forces, overwhelmed, but the Russians, they hadn't used nuclear weapons first, we would not use them. In terms of allies or alliances, these are other countries that we have these defense relationships with, that we would want to engage and kind of be prepared to like have these like cooperative agreements with, where we kind of say like, hey, if you're attacked, we'll defend you. They say, and vice versa. And one of the most significant ones is NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is a combined alliance between the United States and Western European countries. There's a lot of evidence that says NATO countries are completely opposed to this policy. This would substantially hurt our relationships. The same with Japan. Finally, I want to touch on the difference between arms control and disarmament. Disarmament is a movement to get rid of our nuclear weapons. Arms control is a way to kind of like essentially regulate the nuclear weapons to reduce the likelihood that they're being used, right? So no first use would qualify as an arms control policy. There are some other ideas and concepts of literature. I'll kind of update the vocabulary list on the website, but these are some of the basic ideas. I do hope this lecture is helpful to you moving forward as you prepare for the debates. It is a really great topic. There are two strong sides to this. There are two strong sides within the literature. There's a direct clash. You don't have to go kind of, sometimes there's an artificial topic where the controversy is kind of made up so you can debate. This is a great one. There's a lot of scholarly literature on the topic, so it's going to push you beyond just kind of reading things out of the newspaper, which is a little bit of limitation of sometimes of the debates that occur in this format. And I think it's something very interesting to think about and read about, to expose yourself to kind of general questions of military policy, deterrence policy, the role of nuclear weapons in the world.